Hi, I'm Candace Roberts from Historic Gloria Dei Preservation Corporation. Tonight we're going to welcome Marco Federico. Marco is with Materials Conservation, which is an amazing company that does extensive historic preservation work in Philadelphia. Right now they're working on our Keystone Grant project to repair and paint the church and Riverside Hall. And they've worked on projects all around the city and the New York City Library, and Marco's going to tell us about that. One of the fun things that Marco did, although perhaps not so fun for him, was he did suit up in a hazmat suit, climbed under the front of the church here to see if it was a problem, if the building was in fact sinking. So he did discover some uneven sinking due to wooden piers underneath the church, and he's put sensors in there so that we can climb in and monitor it and see if it becomes something that we need to address down the line. Right now we're safe. So as we finish up this Keystone Grant project, we'll be then fundraising for the roof. So I do hope that if you enjoy what Marco has to say tonight, and I could tell you many fascinating stories to come, please consider hitting the donate button and support the preservation's efforts here at Gloria Dei. We will have a live Q&A with Marco following the event. So after the video of Marco's lecture, please do stay on and send along your questions. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Marco Federico. I'm an architectural conservator at Materials Conservation. I've worked in historic preservation for nearly 20 years, based here in Philadelphia, and I'm proud of the many partners that we have worked with and the fantastic sites that we have here in our city. I'd like to share with you 3 of our most challenging and interesting projects here in Philadelphia. I've had the privilege of working on these sites and these monuments. I serve on the board of Gloria Dei. Our firm has a long-standing relationship with the site. We've just recently completed an interior and exterior restoration of the sanctuary, along with other buildings on the historic campus. We've also had the privilege of working on monuments and grave markers on the site. I'd like to share with you 3 separate projects, all based here in the city of Philadelphia. The first one I'd like to talk about is our restoration of the Ben Franklin gravesite located here at Christ Church Burial Ground. Franklin was interred at Christ Church Burial Ground, located at 5th and Arch, in 1790. He's buried with his wife, Deborah. Directly adjacent to Franklin is the marker of his daughter and son-in-law. Ben Franklin specified in his will that he wanted to be remembered by a flat marble ledger tablet. Not something ostentatious, not an obelisk or a pyramid or a column or something that his contemporaries might have chosen. He may have chosen a flat marble marker due to his personality, due to the fact that he didn't want to be viewed as ostentatious. He was austere, he wanted to be seen as austere. It could also have been the Quaker ethos that may have rubbed off. A visitor to the site could experience Franklin's grave marker in one of 2 ways. They could enter through the main gate, or they could experience Franklin's marker through a bronze fence located at the corner of 5th and Arch. In 1858, a hole was opened up in the wall so that Philadelphians could pay their respect to Franklin without entering the site, which was often closed during the day. This fence is interesting. It was installed at some point in the 19th century when we were actually having like a Franklin off between us and Boston, because Boston claimed that they owned Ben Franklin because he was born in Boston. And Philadelphians were angered by this, and it was said that this fence was opened up, this viewing port was opened up in the brick wall so that we could lay ownership to Franklin's legacy. It's probably around the time that the myth of the whole kite and discovering electricity, when all this was fabricated. So during the period where this fence was installed, we also believe that someone had taken Franklin's flat slab out of the ground and put it inside this granite base. The unfortunate thing about that is that it was basically like if you were to put a piece of paper inside a plastic tray. It's going to saturate, it's going to curdle, it's going to become really soft. And that's what was happening to Franklin's marker, was that it was getting really, it was warping. There was a crack that started to open up inside of the marker, being like a long crack starting from, the edge and then ran straight to the center. We also knew that, the corners were damaged. We could see that they had been repaired a number of times. And, the repairs that weren't the most sympathetic repairs, done in concrete and, poorly constructed. We knew that crack was growing every year. We had slowly kept an eye on it. And I don't know if it was environmental factors or what was it, but it got to the point where we noticed that we had to do something. We had to do something quickly. Through those corners, those poorly repaired corners, we were able to remove that material and gain a little bit of insight on why it was failing. And just being able to peer inside and see, that basically like three quarters of Franklin's marker was saturated in water and mud for a better part of the year, along with other detritus, pennies. All the pennies that get thrown onto Franklin's marker would work their way through the cracks and find their way into the underside. I'm not really sure about the whole throwing pennies in Franklin tradition. I don't think it's an appropriate way to be treating our cultural heritage, to be throwing tiny little pieces of metal at it. But I understand that we like our traditions and people think it's good luck, but it's not really a good choice for like long-term service life of historic outdoor marble. So going forward, we knew that we had to deal with this crack. The corners, not only did they provide us with access to the side so we could understand how deep it was. No one knew how deep the marker was. No one knew that it was wet underneath. Those corners also allowed us to remove the marker from that granite pocket that it was sitting in. So using fiberglass shims and wedges of stainless, we were able to drive these shims underneath the slab, carefully raise it up, put wooden blocking, 4x4 blocking underneath the slab, and then from that blocking, then constructed a frame. And then using our gantry and some straps, we slowly hoisted the slab out of the pocket that it was sitting in, up in the air about 3 feet. And it was probably about 30 seconds, but it was like the most harrowing 30 seconds of my life, because I've got this priceless cultural property just hanging in the air. We were able to slide a rolling workbench underneath, and then we placed it onto the workbench and then rolled it away from where it had been set. And all this is going on outside, outdoors. We can hear people talking. We can hear people trying to peep over the fence and find out what we're doing. We're dodging pennies that people are throwing over the top of the fence. So we lifted it up out of the air, we did like a test run, and then put it back down. And then the next day, we lifted it up again, rolled the metal workbench underneath, and then placed it onto the bench, and then rolled it away. So with the Franklin marker out, we could then do two things. We had two teams working on site at that point. We were working simultaneously on the slab, but then we also had to make some modifications to the base. So what was done was we had to change the pitch of the granite slab so that when it rained or when it snowed, the water would run off a lot faster. We also wanted to drill some weep holes into the granite base because we knew that it was collecting moisture, there was mud in the bottom of it, and so we selected the lowest points and then drilled holes on a diagonal from the center so that if moisture did collect on the interior of the monument, that it could find its way out. So while that's happening, we're also working on the Franklin marker, and we're working on it first from the underside. We could tell that the crack was as bad as we had envisioned, that the crack actually went through and extended more than halfway through the marker, down its length. So to deal with this, we created stainless staples that went on the underside, and so they stopped it from separating. And then once that was stabilized from the underside, we micro-injection grouted in from the top of the crack. And what that did was the little micro-injection grout kind of flowed into the lowest parts and sealed it up. And we did multiple passes where we would inject it in, let it set up, inject again, let it set up. So once it's stabilized from the underside, then it's been grouted and that crack's been grouted. Then we can do the aesthetic repairs, we can do the patching, we can do the color matching, we can make sure that the lettering is still visible, we can make sure that we get all of the different colors of the Pennsylvania blue marble. I didn't mention that, but I'm going to take a second to talk about the fact that Franklin's marker was carved from blue marble. I think he specified that he wanted his marble to be carved by a certain individual, a certain monument maker, and he also specified that he wanted it to be made of Pennsylvania blue marble, which blue marble, of course, is quarried close by, and it's a fixture around this part of the city during this time period. So we stabilized the marker. We made some modifications to the base. The other thing we wanted to do was we wanted to move Sarah and her husband's marker away because they were directly adjacent. And this was also creating another kind of microclimate where like one edge of the marker was always staying a little wetter than the other. One edge was exposed to the street and the other edge was staying damp and dark, again, because it's getting wet. There's puddles collecting and it can't dry out on the left side either. So it's creating a microclimate which we wanted to deal with. So her marker was moved about 1 foot over and there was now space between the two. Sarah's marker was also wetting and warping and beginning to turn up on its side a little bit. So we had to make some modifications, not just to Franklin's marker, but the whole site in that little specific area. Another thing that we did with reinstalling the marker that was a little different was that we created a granite plinth for the marker to sit on top of, so that it wasn't in a pocket, it was actually elevated. We used the same kind of granite to match the existing granite, and there's precedent for this. In fact, if you look not even within 10 steps around Franklin's marker, you will see that there are other slabs, other ledger tablets that are up on plinths. So it wasn't like the design vocabulary was already there. We just looked around for a little bit of inspiration. There's a quote attributed to Franklin that he wrote his own epitaph. He did write his own epitaph, but it was never carved on his stone. The only lettering on his stone is just his name, his wife's name, and 1790, I think. So with the restoration complete, with the fence taken down, with the banner that was across the bronze fence removed, people could now see Franklin's marker again. Maybe a lot of people didn't notice the changes that were made. I thought it was interesting that within, 15 minutes of us packing up the site, you can imagine that there were already 50 pennies on the marker by the next morning when we got there. Next, we're going to talk about Old Pine Street's historic cast iron fence facing Pine Street. Old Pine was built in 1768. The Old Pine was built in 1768 looks very different from the Old Pine Street Church that we have today, and underwent a major renovation at some point in the 19th century and kind of transformed it into this Greek revival structure. The portico changed, the fencing changed. It went from brick to an ashlar stucco, which meant that it looked like dimensional blocks of masonry, but it was actually just stucco over brick. And at some point during this period, this cast iron fence was installed. A lot of people like to attribute that to John Havlin's design. John Havlin wasn't the architect of the major renovation of the church, that was John Fraser. But there are people that have some evidence pointing to the fact that Havlin may have designed it. And a lot of people know Havlin because he's a famous architect, not native, but designed many structures in Philadelphia, including, but not limited to, Eastern State Penitentiary. So not really, there's no visual cues there that connect those two, but it's something that is talked about. I don't know what kind of firsthand evidence we have, but regardless, cast iron was all the rage in the 19th century. People would call it iron lace. It was colloquially referred to as. And you can see other examples of this kind of historic fencing all over. What made this fence really interesting was the level of detail. You know, from the corn-cob finials to the harp-shaped balusters that supported the fence sections. And the way it was constructed, it was a pretty simple construction. You had, two harps, we would call them, balusters on either end, and there was a top rail, and then there were pickets that went down vertically through that top rail, and then atop those pickets there were these little corn-cob elements. And these corn-cob finials are actually more popular than you would think. I've seen evidence of corn-cob finials in Savannah, Georgia. I've seen them in historic districts in New York City. So they exist. Apparently it was just another little popular, flourish detail that, was interesting or popular at the time. Over the years, the lean had become progressively worse, and this was due to a tree that was planted probably 100 years ago, and the roots of that tree infiltrated underneath the base of the fence and slowly began to push the fence over. And the other thing I think that happened was the grade may have also changed, and when the grade is up here on one side and down here on the other side, and you've got tree roots pushing it, it's going to give way to the side with the lower grade. So it was beginning to lean quite significantly, and we knew it had to be dealt with. So we did a pilot program where we started on one side, took two small sections out in addition to the gate, because the gate wasn't operable. So with these couple of elements removed and with the gate out, we kind of formulated a plan on how we're going to approach the rest of the fence. We knew that the section that we had taken out was pretty straight, but it also, there was a lot of corrosion. There were some pieces that had been missing. There were some pieces that may have walked off. There could be corn-cob finials on people's mantle pieces in Society Hill. I don't know, but it was not functioning like it needed to be, and it was missing vital, critical components. So we removed all that, brought it back to our studio. The missing elements we took molds of. We cast new corn-cob finials. Whatever was damaged was cut out. Whatever corrosion was there was removed. New cast iron was then welded to the existing cast iron, which matched it in form and in texture and in color. All the failing paint was removed. This was to provide a really clean surface for the new paint coating system to bond to. But every single square inch of paint and corrosion had to be removed. And a lot of that was done by blasting. Cast iron is strong. Cast iron can handle blasting. The areas that we couldn't reach with the blaster a lot of times had to be dremeled out. So this was like careful hand detail work after a bulk of the coating was removed. After all this work had taken place in our studio, then we brought the couple sections back to the site and reinstalled them, made the fence operable again. And this kind of gave us a baseline as to how to approach the rest of the fence, how to solve the problems, what was going to work best, multiplying this by 10. What it didn't give us was a sense of how we were going to deal with the Pennsylvania blue marble base, which all of the fencing was anchored into. And this was a bigger challenge because we had done the work on the iron. We knew how to approach that, but a lot of times with this historic masonry, there's not really a lot of details on initial construction. We didn't really know what we were going to find once we started pulling them out and resetting them. So as you might imagine, all of these blue marble bases, the shape and size was different every single unit. And they're about maybe 8 to 10 feet long, and they weigh about 2,000 pounds, and they're not flat on the bottom. So you're lifting these units out of the ground, and you're looking at the bottom of it, and you're looking at what it's sitting on, and you're thinking, how am I going to get this back into the ground and get it straight and get it level and get it to receive this fence, which no one's looking at the marble. Everyone's looking at the beautiful cast iron. Dealing with the cast iron was one thing. Manipulating these several thousand-pound units of masonry was a real challenge. And we're working on them on the sidewalk. It's not like every single one of these several thousand-pound pieces can just be removed and put on a vehicle and transported back to the studio for conservation. This had to be done directly on site, and with traffic, with passersby. So just like with the Franklin marker, we used a gantry and the use of some very specialized monument handling equipment that's meant to handle large units of masonry. And it would come down like a clamp in the center, and then the weight, its own weight, we would use to pull itself up. It would tighten as you lifted up on it. And a lot of times we would lift it and it would start to list to one side, and we'd have to put it down again and then move the clamp over, try and find the exact center of each one of these bases. And as you can imagine, if they're not perfectly rectangular, perfectly square, one side might dive all the way down, the other side might only come up to a certain point. So where you think the center is, that's never really where the center is. So you have to pick it up and put it down and level it again. And sometimes you have to play with it a couple times to find the exact center. To create stable ground for us to reinstall the blue marble bases, we filled the voids with pea gravel, used brick and other masonry materials to level them. And then at the points where the blue marble met the junction points, we would build a small masonry pier, and that would stop it from listing one way or another, provide a little bit of continuity between the separate units. And then additionally, we would drive stakes in to stop it from moving at all, because you were never really setting one unit at a time. You would set maybe two or three at a time. And you might spend all day trying to get one unit in without it moving. Or maybe sometimes you would set one and then you would take lunch and you would come back and it would have settled and you would have to do it again. And that was really frustrating. So with the process for leveling and resetting all of those marble bases probably took maybe 6 to 10 weeks to get everything lined up, and taking a string and running it all the way down one side and making sure that not a single one of those had moved one way or another. And that's important because it doesn't just need to look good. You also have to remember that those bases have the very simple task of receiving the fence, so that if your base is off, your fence isn't going to fit properly. There were several of these bases that, just due to the way they were taken out of the quarry, sometimes the bedding planes would run vertically. And so there were a couple instances where they had split in half. And so to handle those, we actually had to completely split them and then move them out one at a time, and then make the repairs with the stone on the sidewalk. And it was, the problem was often exacerbated by tree roots, because you can imagine if there's a crack, that crack is holding moisture. And if it's holding moisture, the tree roots are going to find that moisture and they're going to work their way in, and they're going to contribute to the marble splitting further. So there were a lot of instances where we had to do heavy repairs. We had to undertake heavy repairs on the marble bases. With everything set, with everything reinstalled back in place, we were then ready to reinstall the fence. And meanwhile, while all this is happening, the rest of the fence is back in our studio and is being blasted. And again, cast iron repairs, we're cutting out the corrosion, we're welding in new cast iron, we're casting the missing elements, a lot of corn cobs. Contrary to popular belief, there were no interments adjacent to the base of the fence. So that wasn't something, thankfully, that we had to contend with. We did find a lot of stone fragments from grave markers that had kind of been tossed in this fill, but we didn't find any feet sticking out. So with all the repairs to the bases done, it was then time to reinstall the fencing. The reinstallation of the fence did garner a lot of public attention because the way that these fence posts and pickets and balustrades, harps were all fastened was that they were all secured with lead, with hot lead. And it was a pretty effective way to secure them. I mean, you heated up the lead, you poured it into the pocket, it was secured within a couple minutes, and then you can move on to the next one. So what we did was we would make sure that the end pieces were level, build an armature to hold those level, fit the top rail on, make sure that once the top rail was in place, that hadn't moved or changed level, pour those two pieces in with hot lead. Once that had cured and everything was still level, you could go and insert the remaining pickets through the top rail into the little pockets which sat inside of the blue marble base. The process for reinstalling them was that you would just heat up lead right there on the sidewalk, and when it got hot enough, you could tell it was liquid, and you would just pour it into those pockets. A lot of the lead that we used to re-anchor the fence was the same lead that we had taken out, and that was nice that we were able to reuse that material. Some of it did have to be sourced from a local plumbing depot, and they were actually excited that we were buying lead because no one buys lead anymore for that reason. So they were happy to sell us balls of lead. With the newly restored fence in place, you could finally see all of the original details in that cast iron, and I think it really shone through. And the response from the neighborhood was overwhelmingly positive. We would have people complimenting us on our work nearly every day. And that was a really good feeling to complete that project and immediately see people's reactions. The reactions of neighbors and dog walkers and passersby and members of the congregation. It was nice to restore that feature to the landscape. Our next project is on the same block as Old Pine Street Church, and that is the 6 terracotta sculptures in the garden of the Presbyterian Historical Society. They weren't always in the garden of the Presbyterian Historical Society. At one point, they adorned 2 pediments on the Witherspoon building located at Broad and Walnut. There was one pediment on Walnut Street, and another one of the pediments was situated on Juniper Street. And there are 6 figures in total, so there are 3 and 3, and they're made of terracotta. So each one of those sculptures is actually several different units, 3 or 4 units. So there are 6 figures of great historical significance to the Presbyterian Church in the United States. They're commissioned by the Presbyterian Board of Publication and Sabbath Work. And the Witherspoon building was their building, so it was their offices, and they wanted these figures to commemorate their place in American history. So in the 1960s, these figures were removed from the Witherspoon building and placed in storage. And several years later, they were reinstalled in the new home of the Presbyterian Historical Society. So that building was built sometime in the mid-60s. And when the building was completed, they wanted these figures installed in their garden, kind of flanking the entrance, 3 and 3. I believe that the three on Walnut Street and the 3 on Juniper Street, I believe those 3 all stayed together. So these 6 figures were sculpted by Alexander Sterling Calder, whose work can also be seen at Logan Circle. Calder's father was also a sculptor. His sculpture of William Penn sits atop City Hall. Further down the Ben Franklin Parkway, you will see the sculpture of Alexander Sterling Calder's son, Alexander Sandy Calder, who's known for his mobiles, and you can see them on display at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. In 2014, we evaluated the 6 sculptures because we knew that they were failing, and we were trying to find out why. The goal of the investigation was to find out the methods and materials of construction, which we already knew that they were terracotta, but we didn't really know what was going on inside of them. We want to understand the existing physical conditions, and we want to develop a treatment plan. So at first glance, you could see that there was some cracking and some staining, but upon further investigation, we could see that that staining was ferrous staining and that it corresponded with the cracking. And we knew there was something going on within the inside of those sculptures that was causing this. So using a boroscope, we gained access to the insides of the terracotta, and we could see that there were ferrous metal rods that were threaded into the sculpture, and that those rods were encased in cement-based concrete. And so the ferrous rods were getting wet, they were drying, they were corroding, and then that corrosion was causing corrosion jacking, which, if it's encased in concrete, it's going to displace the concrete, and the concrete in turn is going to displace the terracotta, which is the softer material. So the terracotta was cracking as a result of the rusting of these ferrous pieces of rebar. We believe those pieces were probably installed when the sculptures came off of the Witherspoon building and reinstalled onto the grounds of the Presbyterian Historical Society. I don't think that they would have had cast iron or ferrous metal rods when they were initially installed. Also, the way they were initially installed was that they were on this pediment, anchored onto this pediment, and they were probably anchored also into the wall behind it. So the fact that they were now freestanding, perhaps it was thought that they needed a little more rigidity. So we knew that if this was left unchecked, that it was going to get worse and worse and going to cause these units to eventually blow apart. So we developed a treatment plan to deinstall these sculptures by cutting each one of the units apart from its mate and transporting these units one by one back to our studio where we could deal with them in a controlled, clean environment. So they were painstakingly removed at the mortar joints and transported back to our studio. Every single one of those sculptures was photographed, tagged, cataloged, conditions were recorded. We made special note of the ones that were most threatened. There were also units that were generally okay. In our studio, prior to removing any of the rebar, prior to drilling out any of the concrete, every single one of these units was cleaned, was treated with a biocide, so we got the surface clean and we could have a better sense of what we were working with. And it wasn't just removing biological growth or green staining, it was also trying to mitigate some of the ferrous staining, that red staining that you saw. And this particular terracotta was tricky because it didn't have a really glossy appearance. It didn't have a thick glaze on it. So the staining was really challenging to remove because were there a glaze, it might be a little bit easier to remove that, but it was really soaked into the pores. The stain had really been absorbed into the pores, so that was really challenging to remove that kind of staining. The biggest challenge with conserving these terracotta units was the fact that, so terracotta on the inside a lot of times will have webbing, will have like hollow cells, and you can pack those hollow cells with material to kind of secure. A lot of times those hollow cells will have gaps where you can then hook in anchorages so that you can secure them better. But these hollow cells were completely full of concrete. And so to remove that concrete, we basically had to drill out every single one of those cells with the understanding that if we drilled too far, that we would be drilling into the irreplaceable terracotta. So it took a lot of patience and just sensing the weight of what you were drilling into, and if all of a sudden you weren't getting a lot of resistance, you better stop drilling. So this process was repeated. So there were six sculptures. Each one of them was about four to 5 units. So it took us quite a while to remove every single bit of Portland cement and rebar from those units. The ones that were damaged, we were able to do composite repairs to kind of mimic the existing terracotta. And then when it was time for reinstallation, we used stainless rods, which weren't going to corrode. And we also didn't fill the sculpture with concrete because we knew that at some point these may need to get serviced. And again, the focus of conservation, the goal of conservation, you want what you're working on to be retreatable. You don't want to be making permanent alterations to the fabric of the material, because how was someone to fix it again in 20 years? And for the reinstallation, we made use of a small portable crane, which allowed us to carefully pick up each unit and carefully put it back down into place, because every single one of those units had an exact location that it needed to fit back into, and if it was off, the piece above it and below would also be off. So that small portable crane needed to do two things. It needed to be able to carry a load, a significant load, and you also needed to be able to control it, to have pretty good maneuverability, have pretty good control over the terracotta unit when it was in the air. The pieces were reinstalled one by one. All of the components were grouped together upon the installation. Also, all of those units had tags on the inside, so we could be sure that they were grouped properly. And they're also, each piece is unique. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. If you're putting a piece in wrong, it's not going to fit properly. So every single piece had a complex morphology that you could tell pretty quickly if you were putting something in the wrong location. Upon reinstallation, they looked a lot brighter, they looked a lot cleaner. A lot of the green staining was gone from the biogrowth. The ferrous staining was also removed. The vegetation and the plantings surrounding the sculpture were spaced out and weren't in a position where they were, again, creating a microclimate that was going to create damper areas of the sculpture. So upon reinstallation, we communicated with our client, who was also in talks with the landscape designer and the landscaper, to make sure that the plantings that were reinstalled around the sculpture weren't going to be plantings that created microclimates around the sculpture that was then going to increase the chance of deterioration. So I chose these three projects because I thought that they reflect on Philadelphia's rich architectural, historical landscape. All the issues we dealt with throughout these projects, they'd undergone different interventions over the years, and our efforts wouldn't hinder someone else's restoration for the future. And that's a lot about what conservation is knowing that your hands aren't going to be the last hands that are going to be working on this particular object or this particular building. Our approach to conservation is one that reflects not making a change, not fixing something. It's about stewardship. It's about continuing legacies. It's about preserving what's there so that it will still be there in 100 years.
Hi there. I just wanted to say thank you to Marco Federico from Materials Conservation for a really fascinating lecture. I know none of those were talking about Gloria Dei, so that's why I just want to give you our Eastern Grant update. Sarah from Materials Conservation finalizing the painting of our front doors. Now that the weather is nice again, we'll be able to complete the exterior repairs and painting of the church and the final repairs on Riverside Walk. And again, once this project is complete, we will be fundraising for the roof. So I hope you've enjoyed our program this evening, and please hit that donate button. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope you enjoyed the lecture so far, and now it's time for our Q&A with Marco. So if you have questions, please enter them into the chat window, and I will pose those questions to Marco. So I'm going to be a little selfish here and ask a few questions of my own to get us started, and particularly on my favorite subject, which is gravestones. So and graveyards. So Marco, you mentioned that you talked about Benjamin Franklin specifying the type of marble that he wanted his gravestone made out of. And that was, you said Pennsylvania blue marble, is that right?
That's correct.
So what other types of materials were typically used for gravestones in the 18th century?
18th century was really just generally domestic marbles that were usually quarried outside of Philadelphia or in Vermont or other areas in the Mid-Atlantic. You would occasionally see soapstone. Granite came much later, but it was mainly marbles, and some of them were proper marbles, some of them were crystalline limestones that hadn't fully metamorphosed, to be really grainy and not true marbles in that sense. But typically, white stone that we would easily just refer to as marble.
Okay.
Slate, I've seen slate, it's kind of rare, but I've also seen slate grave markers from that time period.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Franklin's marker, that was a flat marker. What's the name of that type of marker?
That's called a ledger tablet.
A ledger tablet. So what other kinds of styles would we see in the 18th century? Because you said specifically that he wanted something that was less showy. So that would mean that there are other kinds of much more showy things that would be at the
Right. So you might see obelisks or pedestals or tabletop markers. And these are, a little more complex with a couple of different moving parts, not moving parts, but different components. And they wouldn't just be a flat slab. They would, rise up or have some kind of, construction that required, a foundation and sidewalls.
Okay. And how do these different materials like marble weather over time?
It really depends on, if, like I said, if they're true marbles, I think true marbles are going to weather a lot better than a lot of the domestic crystalline limestones that we see. But you can see sugaring, you can see them disaggregating, you can see them starting to take on moisture and exfoliate. That can also happen. Again, less likely to happen on true marble, but that's not what we typically see in 18th century gravesite in the Mid-Atlantic area.
Okay. And in terms of the environment, what are the biggest threats to gravestones?
I would say, moisture and shade, and maybe lawnmowers and weed whackers. But definitely moisture and shade, bad.
Okay, so you mentioned microclimates and trying to prevent microclimates from forming inside gravestones, like with Franklin's marker, and as well as the terracotta statues. I was looking at some old pictures of the Gloria Dei Churchyard recently, and saw at one point in time there was ivy everywhere. And I'm assuming that was a bad thing.
Looks quaint, very picturesque, bad for long-term surface life.
Yeah.
So you generally don't want plantings directly adjacent to.
So having grass, is that okay, or?
Having grass is okay. I mean, sometimes it's better if there's like a little bit of pea gravel, or like a ground covering in front of the stones. But grass is okay. But if grass is running right up to the stone, then someone can't pass through the lawnmower, and they're gonna come through the weed whacker, and you'll see a lot of that kind of damage. You'll see like striations along the bottoms of gravestones, oftentimes from weed whackers.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, well that's interesting. It's good to know, because we have a lot of old gravestones in Philadelphia. I mean, just not we didn't talk about gravestones at Old Pine, but I mean that's area is completely packed, just like Gloria Dei. So it's good to know what to plant and what not to plant. At Old Pine, you mentioned that tree roots had found their way under the marble base of the iron fence. Was the tree, there's a very large tree that's that was leaning against the fence. Was that causing was that the causing most of the damage to the fence?
I think it was part of it. It was definitely part of it. I also think at a certain point, and I forget if I said this in the lecture already, but the grade also changed, the grade of the street. And so I think the grade was lowered, and as the grade was lowered, it probably exposed more of that marble base than was initially designed for. So that could also have some kind of impact on it. Because they're tremendously top heavy, if you think about it.
Yeah, so the tree that I'm talking about, for those of you who might not be aware, it was in some of the photos that were in the presentation, but it was cut back and it's now it's been carved into a statue. So if you visit the site, you'll see the statue there, which is interesting. An interesting way of, I guess, keeping the tree. I'm going to grab a question from the audience here. Children in the Philadelphia public schools collected pennies for a Franklin monument. I think that was when the pennies began appearing on the grave marker. Well, that could be. I don't know. I heard on NPR a long time ago that the story about throwing pennies is allegedly it's supposed to bring the penny tosser good luck. And I think we see that at a lot of that kind of behavior at a lot of different historic sites throughout the world. I mean, there's the Fountain of Trevi in Italy where people throw coins, and Lord knows that that's going into water, so that must be a real pain to keep clean. I don't know. Do you know specifically when the Franklin marker penny thing started?
I don't, but I think part of it is the whole, what's the thing he said about pennies? Penny earned.
A penny saved is a penny earned.
But is that attributed to him? I think that's where that came from.
So really, he wouldn't want us throwing pennies at his marker.
Oh, it's a penny waiting. Yeah, he might not. Franklin probably would have thrown a penny at his own grave marker.
Oh.
It would be in his pocket still.
Yeah, definitely. You also mentioned, I don't know if you want me to read this or not, but you mentioned that he had written an epitaph for himself that wasn't used. And I looked up that story. As a young man in 1728, he composed a mock epitaph, which he had shared with a bunch of friends throughout his life. And if you visit the site where Franklin is buried, you'll see there's a plaque on the brick wall that has that epitaph. And it says, "The body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out, and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here food for worms. But the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, corrected and amended by the author." So it's very funny, very silly, but as you said, when it came time for him to be buried, he just wanted his name and the year he died. That's it. So it's interesting how people decide they're going to represent themselves, this way, because he could have had this, and people would have enjoyed it.
He also had to share that marker with his wife.
Yeah, she might not have wanted.
Perhaps she wasn't into it.
Yeah, she's probably tired of it.
The shared space, and he's got to respect her wishes. So who knows the conversation? Honey, I wrote this lovely epitaph for us. Well, for us and for you, I don't know. I'm just saying.
Yeah, maybe so. Okay, I got a couple more questions. When a stone is restored like a gravestone, is there a finish that is added to the surface to help with preservation?
Typically no. Typically no. I mean, if it's really sugaring, if it's really disaggregating, you might want to look at different treatments to sort of strengthen the intergranular cohesion of the marble. But generally, it's not done. I mean, it's done on typically on sculpture, but it can definitely be done. It really just depends on what you're trying to preserve and what's the goal, and what is the failure that you're trying to address. But it's not something I would recommend wholesale applying to whole cemeteries.
So, we should probably take a moment here just because this is something I care about too. I'm sorry, you all, I'm being selfish, but when people visit gravestones, what shouldn't they do?
Don't touch it. People like to do grave rubbings, and I think depending on the condition of the grave marker, you can really cause a lot of damage. I don't want to say that wholesale, but it's generally frowned upon if it's something that's, you know, from the 18th century. Is that you run the risk of damaging it, and I would really recommend people not doing that. Again, I talked about not planting things directly adjacent or up against a gravestone. I think that's why, you know, modern cemeteries have a policy where you can bring your own flowers, but they're not going to let you plant a tree in front or a flower in front of a gravestone in a modern cemetery. So we wouldn't want to. I mean, there's a reason that exists. You know, that they have a you know, a planting, and people can come and give flowers, and then they're removed. So I think it's generally, you don't want to be planting anything. Apart from those two things, I mean, obviously you don't want to like handle them or be running or letting your dog run off leash maybe in a cemetery. That's not something you might want to do. But those are a couple.
So one piece of advice that you gave me a long time ago, which has been golden in terms of my own research, has to do with how to read a gravestone that's difficult to read. Do you remember what you said?
I did. It was raking light. We talked about raking light, correct?
Yep.
Yeah. It was just, you know, you're there at the right time where the sun is kind of like raking across the surface, and a lot of times it'll bring out shadows that you might not see if you're looking at it directly. So that's
Yep.
it. That's, you remembered. Yes.
I did, and I've been practicing.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the reason why people would want to take an etching is because they're trying to read something that's difficult to read. And if we can get the word out that breaking light is just as effective, if not more effective, then maybe we can dissuade people from
Yeah, and then you could take a nice photograph.
yeah.
You know, you could frame that, put it on your wall.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing in terms of photos that I discovered this by accident, also during the breaking light periods, is not just taking a close-up photo of a gravestone, but taking a photo from far away, because that light also revealed in some cases some things that I couldn't read, you know, with that close-up photo. So it's breaking light is key. So everybody remember that. Here's another question. A lot of the stones at Gloria Dei are sunk into the ground. Are they better preserved this way?
That's complicated. It's complicated because a lot of times when they're sunk into the ground, a lot of times if we raise a stone that's sunken down, the inscription's still really crisp, like it's been protected by the soil. So in that regard, yes, sometimes it might be better to leave it, but I think, you know, a lot of people attribute a lot of the wear and tear that you see, the atmospheric wear anyway, on gravestones to like heavy pollution from, you know, the early part of the 20th century. And I'd like to think that it's getting better. I don't think we're burning as much coal as in the city as we were, you know, 100 years ago. I also think that, you know, there's, you know, people using alternate modes of transportation and electric cars. I think that, you know, a lot of the atmospheric soiling that you're going to see today isn't going to be as bad as it might have been like in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I don't know if that's just me being optimistic, but I do think that the air quality is getting better in a lot of modern cities, in this country anyway.
Oh yeah, I think certainly. Well, there around Gloria Dei, for a while it was an industrial. There was essentially an industrial park on all sides of us. And,
Right.
yeah, and that's gone. But we also have I-95 to the one side, Columbus Boulevard to the other. So we're kind of sandwiched between two major thoroughfares. So let's hope that you know, people switch to electric cars or be like me and don't drive at all, you know, and walk everywhere. So help preserve the environment and save those stones. Here's another question. What stone would you use for a gravestone today?
Like for me, for my personal one, I don't know. That's assuming I don't know. It's assuming one would want a gravestone. I guess that person wants a gravestone. You know, the world is your oyster. I mean, whatever you like. If we're talking about durability, you know, granite's going to last a really long time, and I think that that stone technology, stone fabrication technologies come a really long way. So you could get some really nice crisp details in granite today that you might not be able to have gotten, you know, 50 years ago. I like zinc.
Yeah.
There's some really interesting cast zinc grave markers that it's like really popular in the 19th century.
Hmm.
A lot of Civil War era grave sites will have them, and I think they're really cool because they look kind of like bright and white, and you've got like all these great details like cast directly in the metal, and they're just unique. So if I could pick whatever I wanted, I might want zinc. Yeah.
Okay. I think I want soapstone personally, but
It's a long time too. Yeah. It's
yeah,
got a nice.
it's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's such a beautiful color, and our oldest readable gravestones at Gloria Dei are made out of soapstone. But and I think William Penn's marker in England is also made out of soapstone. I think I heard you say once though that soapstone was a cheaper material that people
At the
typically
time,
at the time.
I believe it was. I don't know. I don't know the going rate of soapstone at the moment, but it's not a material that a lot of monument companies would offer. But I know there are a couple of like soapstone quarries in New England that would probably do it for you, but
Yeah,
it's not something that's commonly available.
yeah, yeah. The other material that I love, I guess is it Pennsylvania blue marble that used to be quarried out by King of Prussia that yeah, that you could see, like in my house, I have a fireplace mantle made out of it, and it's so beautiful.
Oh yeah,
Love
they're
it.
gorgeous.
Yeah, and if you've ever been, those of you who've ever been inside the Gloria Dei rectory, there were two of them, so I'm particularly jealous because the rectory is two, and I believe there's also one inside the Roque building, if you've ever been in there. So Gloria Dei has three, but they're beautiful, and it was fashionable, I guess, for a while in the 19th century, and then then other materials became more popular. But yeah, so here's another question from the audience. I know that none of these projects were cheap. Wondering what solutions you have about the myriad of restorations needed all over the city. How can they be afforded?
Uh, that's an interesting question. I guess it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. I mean, is the goal a restoration to the period of the initial construction, assuming that we're talking about a house?
Mhm.
I don't know. I don't know that I have a good answer to that question.
Well,
What I can say is, to do as much of your own research as you can and educate yourself on the building materials that compose your house and understanding how to take care of them and finding a good contractor that has experience using those materials, that's comfortable using those materials, that isn't going to push a
Yeah.
quicker, faster solution. So I would say just do your homework and look into the unique problems of your building, and you can educate yourself and maybe find someone who's willing to work with you.
In terms of sites like Gloria Dei or Old Pine, Christchurch, each one of these sites has there's a separate 501c3 organization that was formed either as a type 3, which is a support organization for the religious institution, or an organization like Historic Gloria Dei Preservation Corporation. We're a completely separate 501c3 independent. So what we do is we apply for grants and we look for funding sources. As Candy mentioned, we just got a Keystone grant this year to repair all of the wood surfaces on the exterior of the church, to paint the interior of the church, and to do wood repairs on Riverside Hall. The fence restoration that you saw at Old Pine, I also happen to be on that board, Old Pine Conservancy. Again, we got a Keystone grant for that. So those grants are matching. So in both cases, we got the grant and we raised 50% to be able to do it. So that's how you do it. You look for grants, you look for funding sources, and you spend a lot of time applying for those things and hoping that you get them. So I don't know if that answers the person's question, but yeah, it's expensive. Like there's no doubt. These projects are costly. These are old buildings. Gloria Dei was dedicated in 1700. I mean, think about that. That building's been there a long time and, requires maintenance. That's just the way it is. There are things like we're going to be fundraising to replace the roof pretty soon. And that's a huge project, right? Very expensive. So we're going to be trying to tap all these different funding sources to make that project happen. So that's what we all do as people who serve on these boards for preservation corporations, nonprofits, things like that. So I hope that helps.
That was good. You answered the site question, and I tried to deal with it from a homeowner's perspective.
Yeah, yeah.
I think between those two options, those two ways of looking at it, I think there's a lot out there, but you've got to research and look into it. And a 501c3, if you're a site and you're eligible, is a fantastic way to get mobilized and to look. It really opens up a wide opportunities for you and your organization.
Yeah, I think it's pretty critical actually nowadays. I mean, I'm heartbroken every time I read the newspaper and I read about a site that's just in complete disarray. It's falling apart. It's, in danger of collapsing, whatever it is. It's terribly heartbreaking. So I'm so grateful that in Philadelphia that so many of our historic sites have organizations that are supporting them. We're really lucky, but we're all vying for the same pots of money, right? So that's the other thing. When we're applying for a Keystone grant like Historic Gloria Dei, Old Pine Conservancy is probably applying for one too, or the Christchurch National Trust is probably applying for one too. So we're all working on it and doing our best. Marco, do you anything else you want to say?
Just thanks to everybody who tuned in and listened and asked great questions, and to the people who showed up here tonight. Thank you, and thanks for your interest, and also thanks to the sites that have worked with us on these great projects, and thanks to Gloria Dei for allowing me to give this talk. It's been a lot of fun. I've never done anything like this before, so it was a really nice experience, and I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was a lot of fun. So, and I learned a lot. I mean, even on the projects that I'm involved with, like the fence, right, at Old Pine, I learned a lot from your talk that I didn't know. So thank you very much. And you all, thank you for joining us this evening. And, as Candy mentioned, we are still fundraising. We're going to be fundraising toward the roof. So if you enjoyed our program, please consider making a donation on our website, preserveoldswedes.org. Thanks so much. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.